Je suis Marijke Colle.
Hello, comrades. My name is Marijke Colle. I live in Belgium now. I used to live in Britain for 9 years and in France for 2 years, so I also know those two other countries. I am now retired. I used to be a teacher in biology and chemical science in the secondary education. I'm working with ecology since the 70s. I used to write every week in our organization's newspaper. Apart from that, I've always been motivated by women's issues. I was the first president of an abortion center in Flanders at the time. So ecology and feminism are my two big topics on which I am both politically active and which I studied academically. My goal for today is to share with you the last data of the current climate crisis, but mostly my goal here is to um, motivate you, to incite you to struggle against the climate crisis and to build a movement for climate justice and in order to save the climate. In order to do this, we need to base ourselves on scientific facts and on knowledge of the climate crisis. It doesn't need to be a detailed knowledge, but still we need to mm, have the big picture in mind. And well, the outline of this big picture is being given by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So, what is the current climate situation? Well, first, despite all the rhetorics that we've seen, the the emissions of dioxide of greenhouse gases have not decreased since 1958, since we measure those emissions on a small volcano, Mauna Loa, which is in Hawaii. So here you can see this graph, which starts in 1958. It never decreases, and in the last few years, it's been increasing even more rapidly. We now have 419 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When I started to study in the 70s, we were a bit above 300. So in my own life, I saw the CO2 rate in the atmosphere increasing impressively. The climate crisis is so clear for everyone that nowadays almost everyone except for uh, wackos and reactionaries and fossil capitalists, except for those people, everyone agrees to say that we need the CO2 rate not to increase anymore. The official goal is that the increase in temperatures should be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius degrees. For climatologists, for the IPCC, this goal will be impossible to reach because even with the most radical measures which could be taken, we would arrive at 1.6 degrees. So the most radical measures that we would need to stay below 1.5 degrees would lead the planet to be allowed to only spend 500 gigatons of CO2 in total. Currently, the Earth needs, or the human society in the world spends 40 gigatons a year. That means we have a bit more than 10 years left of status quo. In the current scenario, what we can see is that by 2100, there would be an increase in the Earth temperature of 4.7 degrees. This is unbelievable. In the last 1 million years, the Earth has never been that hot. What's more is that the methane emissions, which is a greenhouse gas which is even stronger than CO2, while the emissions of methane increase as well because of the unfreezing of the permafrost, which are the frozen grounds, the frozen soils around the Arctic. The melting down of the permafrost will probably lead to 0.5 degrees increase. So even in a scenario, even in the most radical scenario where we drastically limit the greenhouse gases emissions, there will be things which cannot be foreseen. There are tipping points which cannot be excluded and which cannot be foreseen. They cannot be foreseen because they do not fit in any model, in any scheme. What's more, in preparation of the COP26 in Glasgow, what we now know is that the climate plans of each government are completely insufficient right now and would lead us to climate temperature increase of 3.5 Celsius degrees. So while our main problem is to understand, is to know how to limit the CO2 emissions, this problem is not solved at all, and solving the problem is not even thought of, really. This means that climate change continues and temperature increase continues. The global surface temperature of the Earth can be seen here on this graph. Well, I can't see the years here. Well, you see the graph. So currently the surface temperature, which is being measured, is, so you can see it in red. This is the average. And this surface temperature has increased by more than 1.1 Celsius degree already in recent years. So this surface temperature is absolutely out of control. So the temperature increase on the Earth is unequal. For instance, the temperature of the soil, of the land, is increasing way faster than the temperature of oceans, which leads to the heating of the Arctic being faster than the heating of the oceans and being faster than the average heating of the Earth, probably twice faster. Last year, we had more than 30 Celsius degrees in Finland, in northern Siberia, and in Arctic in general. We witnessed temperatures which we had never recorded before in human history. In other regions, which are not completely in the north, but like between the north and the tropics, you can see surface temperatures of the Earth during the hottest days, which have become completely unlivable. So that's the case, for example, in the Middle East. I remember comrades in Pakistan telling me about a lot of people in the summer in urban areas which simply do not go out of their houses during the day because it's way too hot, yes, outside. So people don't have enough sun. You know, this problem which people know in Scandinavia or whatever, well, they know it in Pakistan now because they cannot go out because it's too hot. In some urban areas, you have completely unlivable days. This is also what happened recently in the Western United States and in Canada, with temperatures which did not go below 30 Celsius degrees during the night. So the global heating is going faster and is unequal according to the different regions of the planet. Here, well, wait. Let me zoom a bit. Can you see it? Oh. Here you've got the different graphics with different climate data or climate indicators, which all show the same trend. The second graph is methane emissions. You can see that the emissions are increasing even faster and faster. Then you've got nitrous oxide, which is also a strong greenhouse gas. Then you've got here, the fifth is about the decrease of the ice in the Arctic Sea. The sixth is the mass of the ice on Greenland, which is also decreasing extremely fast. Here you can see the same thing in the South Pole, in the Antarctic, with ice melting down faster and faster. And then here on the eighth graph, you've got the width of the ice surface. Then you've got the temperature of the oceans as the ninth. Then you've got the acidity of the oceans as the 10th graph, which is decreasing a lot. Or rather, the acidity increases a lot, which poses a great threat to marine biodiversity. And the last two I'll leave aside. The meltdown of the ice on the poles is also accompanied by the meltdown of ice on glaciers in the mountains. It is almost certain that those glaciers and others on the surface of the earth will continue to melt down in the next decades. So there will be a brutal meltdown of the ice sheets on the poles. This will have an effect on all regions depending on big rivers, such as the many rivers in South Asia and Southeast Asia, the Amazon, the Rhine, and so on. All those big rivers will receive less snow after the winter, and the final disappearance of the glaciers will lead to heavy droughts and so on in the spring and in the summer. Let me come back to oceans. The heating of oceans will be twice to 4 times more important than in between 1971 and 2018. So the heating of the oceans will increase very fast. This will lead to an increase in acidification and in oxygen being released from the oceans. There are already great zones in Mexico, for example, where you don't have any oxygen anymore, which leads to biodiversity loss. So heating up of the oceans, acidification, and oxygenization of the oceans. So this leads to a loss of biodiversity, to the death of corals, to the death of shell organisms. And the temperature also has a consequence on the size of fish. So also on fishery, it has effects. Then you've got exceptional tides, which you could see only once in a century in the past, and now you can see it more and more. We think that this could happen once a year at least. The increase on the level of the oceans because of the meltdown of glaciers and ice and so on will lead to will put in danger hundreds of thousands of lives of people living in zones which are less than which are at a level of less than 2 meters above the oceans. In some regions in India, in Brazil, and in Bangladesh, and so on, in Egypt, we might lose millions of people are at risk of having to be displaced, and we will lose millions of hectares of cultivable lands and so on. Then we've got climate phenomena, which are linked with the heating up of the poles. Here you can see a picture of a big glacier in the Antarctic, which is starting to melt down, or to disaggregate completely, rather. And then here around the poles, you've got the jet stream, which is caused by the fact that north of the jet stream it's colder, south it's hotter, and this leads to systems of cyclones and anticyclones, which enable a polar circle wind, a wind which circulates around the poles. Now, because of the heating, the difference of temperatures between the north and the south of the jet stream is decreasing because the Arctic part is heating up. So the difference in temperatures becomes smaller, and this slows down the normal jet stream. And when the jet stream becomes weaker, it can become irregular. This is what you can see in the right part of the picture, the second part of the picture. So we've got a weaker jet stream where the undulation leads to kinds of new systems so you've got places where the wind is being blocked, basically. So you've got periods of completely deregulated weather situations with extremely cold temperatures recently after the supposed end of the winter in Canada and the US. Now, recently we had flooding rains in Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, and Luxembourg. So those floods led to 50,000 cars being destroyed, for example. So you've got to know what to do with those destroyed cars. And this was due to the changes in the jet stream system. Because east and west, you had a dry weather, and so the rains were blocked above Belgium and Germany, leading to flooding rains.
The same weakening of the jet stream is what has ultimately led to long periods of drought. Increasingly, this type of logjam of weather systems. So you obviously understand that this deregulation of the climate system from one day to the next, this disruption clearly has an impact on farming. I can give you a current example here in Belgium. The potato harvest is much smaller because of these rains and the dampness of the soil. So the harvest has gone down this irregular pattern of rains and droughts has also led to an locust or grasshopper invasion, which we've seen in East Africa. This is just killing a lot of plant life the world over. Deforestation, which has continued in the Amazon in South America. But we also see deforestation continuing in Southeast Asia, and all this is just aggravating these weather phenomena. The less forest you have, the more drought you have. The more forest you have, the more rain you have. And so this kind of random, disrupted system is having an impact on farming, and it's becoming unbearable and even having deadly effects. So these waves of deadly heat waves, this unbearable character of daily life is such that you have to include this in the consequences of climate change. The most optimistic forecast from the IPCC, that is an increase of 1.6 degrees and not 2. The heat waves 4 times every 10 years. That's the most optimistic forecast. So with an increase of 1.6 degrees. All this climate chaos and all these consequences have not been produced by so-called overpopulation or by excessive consumption. No, it's actually the wealthy, the rich, who have caused 50% of emissions, and it's the poor populations who are the biggest victims of these disastrous climate changes. I think it's very important to stress this, because in the IPCC's scientific report totally ignores this social side. They have a very technocratic approach to science, and they put forward solutions that really aren't solutions, actually. So I now come to the second part of my presentation on the solutions offered by so-called green capitalism. So this green capitalism is a nice slogan. It's what I think you can call an oxymoron. That is a term that itself is internally contradictory. Capitalism is cannot be green, because capitalism tries to combine continuous growth and lowering emissions. It's based on private ownership of the means of production, which are in the hands of individual capitalists who themselves are in competition with each other. This leads to a race for profit, and this race for profit leads to productivism, which means that production has to take place at the lowest cost and with a total disregard for the impact on ecosystems. Capitalisms, which it seeks to combine two things which are incompatible. It wants to combine continuous growth. Green capitalism doesn't want to lower growth, but it wants to combine continuous growth with lowering emissions. This and the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has just released a report in which it says they are in favor of nuclear energy. And so their idea is to produce more nuclear energy to lower CO2 emissions. And this means driving down wages, because the cost of nuclear is astronomical. So for the IEA and for green capitalists, you have to be pro-nuclear, so-called modernized nuclear energy. You have to lower wages to compensate the huge investments that are going into nuclear energy. And they're upholding a lie. the lie of a so-called carbon neutrality. So what does this mean? It enables industries in Europe to continue to produce steel while producing a lot of CO2, and in compensation for this, there's a promise to plant trees. I'll come back to this whole notion of planting trees. So this green capitalism is an ideological lie which seeks merely to protect the system. Of course, individual capitalist or specific branches of the system, such as certain department store chains, which do want to green their what they sell in terms of going toward organic agriculture, but that's very marginal, really. Fundamentally, the system will not stop wanting to accumulate the greatest amount of profit through the greatest amount of growth. And of course, there's the fossil fuel lobby, which continues to build coal-fired power plants, and which continues to extract gas and oil, and now wants to is seeking to get around hydrogen, because hydrogen can be produced using natural gas, and it can also hydrogen can also be the cleanest way is using water. So now the current American president, Biden, has set up a climate plan in which he's promoting hydrogen, and in this vein, he's giving a gift to the fossil fuel industry, because he's promoting a solution where hydrogen is produced through natural gas and water, which is not carbon neutral, which is not emission free. So Biden's hydrogen plan is really a hidden way to continue to subsidy the fossil fuel industry and this fossil fuel lobby, which of course is quite powerful in big oil producing countries such as in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, but also oil that continues to be produced in many third world countries, which continue to extract oil from the land. Banning oil and gas extraction is a key demand for our movement if we want to reduce CO2 emissions. There's also an agribusiness or agrochemical lobby which continues to hoard lands and to set up monoculture exports, and to this end destroying ecological forms of agriculture. We can discuss the terminology. What I mean by this is a farming that doesn't use pesticides, diversified, that's focused on feeding the local population, people's needs in the local area. Ecological farming, which combines agriculture or farming with limited animal husbandry, and many fruits and vegetables, ecological agriculture that is profitable the world over, but only on condition that you factor in all the costs associated with agrochemical farming. This type of mainstream farming destroys forests, but it is also destroying lands wherever it carries out farming, whether in the United States, Europe, USA, Canada, and elsewhere. This type of farming has a very strong chemical lobby with strong connections to the finance sector, And it unfortunately hasn't met much resistance. And I think the climate movement hasn't really fully grasped the role of this agrochemical lobby. And then this whole idea of planting trees, it's a form of neocolonialism, but it also destroys the indigenous people's livelihood. Bolsonaro in Brazil says that it's a caricature to say this. That people sometimes say that Bolsonaro is a caricature. No, in fact, it's not a caricature at all. He actually destroys indigenous peoples. He actually says quite openly that they're rats that should be killed off. And he has them killed off by militia and through the destruction of their ecosystems. And so when we're looking at green capitalism, one factor that's stressed is that we should do better. That is you and I, that is ordinary people. We face this type of guilt tripping. People are told that they should consume less, they should drive their vehicles less, and that consumption is the cause of the climate crisis rather than the functioning of capitalism. No, the cause of the climate crisis is all of us. There are too many of us, and too many of us consuming too much. This is this Malthusian ideology, which says that there are too many people who all want to live like Americans with AC, air conditioning, and 2 cars on their driveway or in their garage, that we're all the cause of the climate crisis. But at the same time, they don't say that we, the people, have no control over what's produced, how it's produced, by whom, and how transportation is organized. That textile factories in China are pouring out merchandise for American stores, so we don't have any control over that. And it creates this illusion that we can be virtuous in daily life. Some capitalists even encourage veganism. That is, if they're not involved in animal cattle farming or but the whole idea is to have a kind of good conscience. I can give you a few examples. People are guilt tripped for eating too much meat, but if all Belgians stopped eating meat, and I know the numbers for Belgium, there would still be 6 million chickens exported each year because poultry production is for export. There would be millions of potatoes, frozen potatoes exported for French fries. I think 1/3 of potatoes grown in Belgium are for local consumption. The rest are frozen potatoes exported the world over. So this whole rhetoric avoids talking about the actual impact on the impact and the whole how the system works. Rather, people are just guilt tripped. Don't eat meat. Use your car less. But there's much more to be said about cars, and I'll get to that later. The other thing that people say is that trees should be planted to reach carbon neutrality. I'm not against planting trees, but it's just a lie to say that planting certain types of trees, so, for example, poplar trees, would do the same thing as actual complex forest systems, complex tropical forest systems. Tree planting is a lie, and it never makes up for natural forests that are destroyed. Planting trees is, of course, a good thing to lower temperatures in cities. In the city where I live, Ghent, there are 370,000. There are 300,000 trees. And if you plant 1 tree more for each inhabitant, that would improve the planet. That would reduce the heat effect. But it doesn't. This planting would not replace the impact on destroyed forest systems. In the IPCC report, they're really focusing on dangerous technologies which have not proved their effectiveness. The main technology that's focused on is carbon capture and sequestration, CCS. That is, you capture carbon and you bury it in the ground. This technology is unproven, but it's used by the IPCC to say that there are technical solutions to the climate problem, to the climate crisis. Here's a graphic. In the best case scenario of the IPCC, which you can see here in this slide, in this best case scenario, this is where we are in 2020. We're, according to this scenario, at the peak of emissions, and we want to reach zero emissions by 2050. That's the official goal with all these climate plans. I don't think we won't reach that with these climate plans, but in this technocratic approach, emissions drop, but on top of this, there's talk of artificial carbon removal. That is the artificial removal of carbon, of CO2 from the atmosphere. Removing it from the atmosphere and putting it somewhere. Where exactly is not clear. So this actually leads to negative emissions in these projections. And the idea here is that in somewhere near 2100, we'll actually have negative emissions, which would lead to a drop in CO2 rates in the atmosphere. And since this obviously is tied to temperatures, this would lead to a drop in the Earth's temperature to return to the natural rates. But this is just a lie. It's based on a scenario which is actually the optimistic scenario for the IPCC. It's really an illusion, and it's with these ideas that the IPCC is seeking to create hope. In the most recent IPCC report is actually quite despairing. It creates a lot of desperation. If you read it, the heating is speeding up, it's intensifying, but there's this kind of life buoy there's throwing out to say that, well, with these technologies, we can reverse the trend, but this is false hope. The idea of a real global climate plan is not advanced in the report. I think that's where I'm expected to stop.